Continuing with globalization, there are some trends that we can say are shaping not only the present, but perhaps the future. And as with analyzing more current events or recent events, it's sometimes difficult for historians to really get a grasp of what the history is unfolding before our eyes. But we can certainly say within the past 20 years or so, in the last chapter of world history, there have been some significant developments and significant events to have taken place, but perhaps it's a little bit too early to truly understand their importance. So what are some trends that are shaping the current global history here? One we can say without a doubt is the acceleration of globalization, which is referenced in the image that you see. That is, globalization is defined as the interconnectedness of the world. And certainly since the ending of the Cold War in 1989, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the reigning supreme of American capitalism, but really worldwide capitalism, globalization is more true today than it's ever been. Some examples of this include OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This is an international coalition between primarily Middle Eastern nations that produce petroleum, aka oil or gasoline for your car, and are willing to work together beyond simple national borders. The European Union is another great example with its currency, the euro, which can be used in any of the European Union zones. Again, this is a breakdown of barriers and an increase in interaction, whether that is economic or people moving, migrations. You have trade agreements like NAFTA, which stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is a free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, which allows those nations to trade with one another with no barriers and no taxes. So once again, our national borders being removed and more interconnectedness of the globe. The World Trade Organization is an organization specifically dedicated to breaking down trade barriers so more people around the world can trade freely with one another. Now, we can certainly say that standing here right now, there is some good examples of globalization increasing, but also responses to it. And certainly in the past decade or so, there has been clear examples of nations really sort of kind of backlashing against this increase in globalization by promoting stronger ideas of economic nationalism. That is, to look after one's own economy, to protect one's economy, to set up barriers to one's economy. Because while globalization does have a lot of benefits, NAFTA, for example, it also has some downsides to it. And one of the clear examples of how some places have really backlashed against this increased globalized world would be something like Brexit, in which Great Britain voted to leave the European Union. So the European Union brought European countries together so they could freely trade and move across each other's borders. But Brexit is Great Britain leaving that organization and instead looking more after themselves. So again, being kind of as this is unfolding in the current time, it's really too early to tell kind of which way the world will continue going. To a certain degree, even the rhetoric of President Donald Trump is protectionist and nationalist in a sense, advocating for more tariffs or barriers against China. So we'll see how this plays out, whether the world goes down a more globalized route, economically speaking, or whether it goes down a more protectionist or economic nationalist route. In 2008, and this is what perhaps was maybe some guard against this increased connected global economy, was the financial crisis of 2008. This was rooted in the United States, specifically in housing prices. Long story short, home loans or mortgages were made to people who couldn't afford them. Housing prices increased dramatically. The speculation was that the home prices would continue to go up, and then banks and investors used those mortgages, which they believed were good, which people they believed they could pay them back, and then used that as leverage to make a bunch of risky investments. And when people could no longer pay for their homes, it had a chain reaction throughout the economy, and it sent the United States and the world into a depression, the worst depression since the 1930s, the Great Depression. Longstanding banks like Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers was a bank that was open for over 100 years, went out of business. President Barack Obama, responded to the economic crisis by pumping money back into the economy. Barack Obama, the U.S. president, including bailing out the U.S. auto industry so it wouldn't go bankrupt. At the time, the U.S. auto industry was responsible for perhaps 1/6 of all the jobs in the United States. And if the auto industry went down, the catastrophe of unemployment was so poor, so bad, that the auto bailout was a solution to that potential problem there. We can also see, politically speaking, on a global stage that perhaps we're moving more towards a more democratic world. In Russia, for example, Vladimir Putin, who served as president for 2 terms, willingly stepped down. Now, one of the benefits that we have today as I'm making this video is that Vladimir Putin has re-put himself back as president of Russia. So we know that at least in this case, it hasn't been an acceleration of democracy. Myanmar, which had long been a militarily ruled country, moved towards democracy in the 2000s. Aung San Suu Kyi pushed that country to a more democratic place. In South Africa, the election of Nelson Mandela, who had been imprisoned under the apartheid regime. The apartheid regime in South Africa segregated the white and black population. It wasn't until, I believe, 1994 that the system of apartheid fell, and that Nelson Mandela, and after the system of apartheid fell, democratic elections were held. Nelson Mandela was democratically elected president of the United States. South Africa, during the apartheid regime, again, this is following the theme of increasing democracy. South Africa at the time had only let white citizens vote. In the first true democratic elections where white and black citizens voted, Nelson Mandela, who had been put in prison for 30 years or so, was elected the first black president of South Africa. In Sudan, the southern part of Sudan successfully broke away. This was a region that was plagued by genocide and violence for a very long time. Sudan, since the era of imperialism, had arbitrary borders drawn around it by the British. This is a long historical problem with imperialism and how the borders of certain countries are drawn. It more or less grouped 2 populations, a northern Islamic population with a southern sub-Saharan African population. And the conflict in the 2000s was the Darfur conflict, again, in which genocide occurred. Omar al-Bashir, the ruler of Sudan and the ruler of the Muslim North, was tried for war crimes in that. And South Sudan successfully broke away, exercising more democratic power, at least in that particular region. The Arab Spring also witnessed countries in the Middle East give rise to new democratic governments. Libya, Tunisia, in Syria, it erupted into a civil war. But generally speaking, we can say that looking at all these things together, it appears as perhaps we're moving more towards a democratic trend. On the other hand, there also is instances of backtracking democracy. Like I said before, Vladimir Putin has more or less made himself the dictator of Russia. And in China, where communism continues to thrive, and even though the Chinese economy is opening up to more free enterprise, there really is no indication that China has any plans on stepping more towards democracy. We might look at some of the recent protests in Hong Kong, for example, for more political change there. So perhaps moving more towards a democratic world, but also we have some examples, again, in the recent time of backtracking from democracy. Another trend, again, looking towards where we currently stand and the trajectory of where the world is moving on from the Cold War, and it's been difficult for historians to define really what the next era of history is. Like I mentioned before at the beginning, we really have to sort of let things play out so we get the proper perspective to look back and understand what is historically significant. It's very difficult to write the history of current events, but as some have suggested, perhaps we are moving more towards a clash of civilizations, not like a clash of ideologies like the Cold War, and not a clash of national pride like you saw in World War II and World War I, where nationalist nations went to war with each other, but rather the world being divided up into various civilizations, a certain set of beliefs, ideas. So, for example, the big clash here would be between the West and the Middle East or Islamic world. And this is evidenced by the September 11th attacks, where a terrorist group named Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, successfully hijacked American commercial airplanes and flew them into the World Trade Center and flew them into the Pentagon. The response to this, so Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, there he is pictured right there, Al-Qaeda, an international terror organization, who was motivated by their resentment of the United States for their influence in specifically the Middle East, whether that was support of Israel, military bases in Saudi Arabia, the influence and power the United States had as a global power, that was resented by bin Laden and his followers. Here we have a map where Al-Qaeda operates. It is an international organization, does not operate in one single country, but rather spans beyond borders and looks to use specific terror tactics, that is the targeting of civilians and military targets, to create a sense of fear and hysteria. The response by the United States to the September 11th attacks was the global war on terror. That was to declare war against anyone, anywhere, any place that seeks to do harm to the United States, including people who could be located inside the United States itself. So unlike conventional wars or traditional wars, it wasn't a war declared on a specific country or a specific organization even, but rather an ideology and a tactic, right? The use of terror. In Afghanistan, the Taliban government harbored and assisted organizations like Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan was the first target of the global war on terror. The United States declared war on Afghanistan in 2001. The Taliban government was ousted from power for their support of Al-Qaeda. And with this new doctrine, or with this new war on terror, the United States was following a new doctrine, and that was preemptive attack. Preemptive attack is to make the first strike. In other words, according to the Bush administration, George W. Bush, who was the US president at the time, that there are people outside or maybe even inside the US that are seeking to do a massive amount of harm to American citizens. And therefore, it is not only okay, but perhaps even preferred if the United States strikes first to prevent devastating attacks, to prevent something like September 11th from happening again. And this was a new shift for the US. In this speech, or in another speech, I should say, George W. Bush outlined who he called the axis of evil. Those are regimes who seek to do harm to the United States, or at the very least, seek to harbor groups like Al-Qaeda who want to do harm to the US. In that axis of evil speech, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were identified as the axis of evil to which the United States opposed. This doctrine of preemptive attack led to the second war in Iraq by the United States. Recall the Persian Gulf War was a war to oust Saddam Hussein, or Iraq War I, sometimes as it's called, was a war to oust Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. In that war, the United States was playing global police, essentially, protecting Kuwait from an aggressive nation like Iraq. In 2003, the motives were a little bit different. Saddam Hussein, who was the military dictator of Iraq, both in the Persian Gulf War and in 2003. It was claimed by U.S. military intelligence that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, WMD, and the fear was that if those weapons, like nuclear bombs, get into the hands of al-Qaeda, the death and destruction will be far greater than that of September 11th, which was commercial airplanes. And so the United States made the case to the rest of the world that Saddam Hussein and Iraq were developing weapons of mass destruction, and that the United States needs to exercise its doctrine of preemptive attack, strike Iraq first before those weapons fall into the wrong hands. The United Nations wanted to do further inspections of the sites in which the U.S. claimed weapons were being developed. The United States did not want to wait around for the UN, and so with a coalition of the willing, that is, those who were willing to follow this doctrine of preemptive attack, joined the United States in the war in Iraq in 2003, also called Operation Iraqi Freedom. One of the main nations to participate in this coalition of the willing included Great Britain, which was a close ally. Other nations like China and Russia objected to this. Now, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. military was very successful in ousting those regimes. The Taliban was pushed out of Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein was captured and executed. Baghdad, the capital, was also captured by U.S. forces. However, it was the effort to rebuild those countries that proved difficult. The U.S. occupied both Iraq and Afghanistan for decades after those wars were over and continued to seek and rebuild stable nations in both of those regions, nations which will not be, an environment for which terror organizations like al-Qaeda could thrive. In the end, the weapons of mass destruction were never found, and so claims by U.S. intelligence before the onset of the war turned out to be false, and this has led to a lot of speculation and conspiratorial thinking about Iraq. If weapons of mass destruction were not the reason for U.S. involvement, then what was the real reason? This also helped to delegitimize the United States in the eyes of people around the world, which believed that this was not a legitimate intervention if there turned out to be no weapons of mass destruction. U.S. intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq had only continued to inflame conflict in the Middle East. Israel's presence and history there continued to be a site of violence and conflict even up into the 2000s and to the present day. Hezbollah, a pro-Iranian Shiite government or political faction in Lebanon, received a large number of votes and governmental influence. Hamas, the militant Palestinian political party, also gained power in Palestine. And continued violence in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip are two parts in Israel where they are predominantly Palestinian in nature. Again, the conflict in the Middle East largely revolves around Israel, which is a Jewish state, and Palestine, which is a Muslim or Arab state. And the West Bank and the Gaza Strip continue to be sites of violence. In both cases, Israel has resorted to building walls to physically stop things like suicide bombs. Missiles are fired over the walls. Israeli Defense Force carries out bombing campaigns in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that area has continued to be a site of violence. Now, terrorism itself as a tactic has been around, since before 2001. It's been used by various political organizations and groups. It typically involves a much smaller military constituency carrying out horrific attacks against civilian and military targets of a more powerful one. But even before the September 11th attacks, the United States had been a target of terror organizations. Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, called for jihad or holy war against the United States. Various attacks against the U.S. included U.S. embassies in places like Kenya during the 1990s. The USS Cole, a US battleship, was blown up by terror organizations before September 11th. In fact, the World Trade Center in 1993, a bomb went off in the basement of there, and a terror suspect or terrorist who had attempted to blow up the Trade Center in 1993 had failed to do so. However, 2001 might be a turning point with the global war on terror. This is a much more aggressive stance the United States has taken, especially in the aftermath of September 11th, which was the deadliest attack on American soil and the deadliest terror attack since the ending of the Cold War, perhaps even ever, in terms of the amount of life that was lost in September 11th. There's also been a continued push for universal rights and values. The United Nations declared a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This goes with the trend of globalization, that we're living in a more connected world today than we'd ever been in the past, and that there should be some sort of universal rights. Various organizations like non-governmental organizations or NGOs have been increasingly influential around the world. Such examples include Amnesty International, which seek to break people out of prison from oppressive regimes they deem are innocent. Doctors Without Borders, who want to provide assistance and medical help to people no matter where they live. And the ability to work beyond borders is a sign that we're moving more towards a globalized world. We can also say the same thing about culture, that technology has really helped in this front anyways. Media, internet, television, movies, music. We're sharing culture today at a rate that we've never shared before. We have access to television shows and music from around the world. And what's really been key in this has been the development of the internet and the interconnectedness that we have simply through devices like computers and cell phones. However, some have criticized this increasing new global culture as cultural imperialism. Imperialism is a stronger force taking over a weaker force, and that rather than a new global culture developing, perhaps it's just one culture dominating all the rest. One good example of this is English as a language, which every day becomes spoken by more and more people, almost to the point where it is a global language. And you do see some backlash against this global culture, especially resentment towards Western culture in particular, but not exclusively. It could be resentment towards other cultures as well. Here's a map of the percentage of people who speak English. And technology. Technology is making this all possible. And technology is one of those things that, when it builds on itself, it allows for more development to take place. And the amount of acceleration that we've had in technology is bringing us to a different world, every decade. And so some of the important contributions to this include a 24-hour newscast, CNN, the cable news network, where we know really about everything going on at every moment. The internet, the World Wide Web, e-commerce, social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Google. All of these things are having a profound impact on the globe, and there's no doubt that it's profound, but yet we still don't know the full implications of what this all might do. Will it all bring us into a new global world in which we thrive as a species, or will this be our downfall in which technological influences further divide us and send us down a path of strife and civil war? Again, with the last chapter of world history, it is too early to tell.